Education Corner podcast is so excited to welcome Professor Elliot Major today. Lee is Professor of Social Mobility at the University of Exeter and is the first professor in this field.
We're thrilled, Lee, to have you today on our Education Corner podcast and to hear a little bit about the work you're doing as the Professor of Social Mobility at Exeter University. Can you tell us a little bit about what this involves?
So my role is quite unique in many ways. I'm the first professor of social mobility in the world, we think. There's a few more now. And what that means is I'm particularly interested in the prospects for disadvantaged learners. And that might be in the early years, it might be in schools, it might be access to university or indeed the workplace. But my work is really trying to improve the opportunities and outcomes for the poorest learners. So I'm in the education department at the university, and I'm an unusual professor in that I'm very much focused on practice and policy. So I do lots of research, but most of my time I'm interacting with other people, whether it's school leaders, university vice chancellors, ministers, policymakers, and even company chief execs. And the constant in all that is, how do we improve the prospects for all learners? So it's a very worthy goal. And I'm increasingly busy with all this, but that's it in a nutshell.
A fantastic initiative, and I'm pleased you're the first professor. It's quite a title. In 2020, Exeter released an access and participation plan, which is committed to the principle that everyone with the potential to benefit from higher education should have an equal opportunity to do so. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this plan and what it involves and how you hope to see changes around the university?
So Exeter University is an amazing university, but one of the challenges we've had is attracting talented young people from all backgrounds. So if you look at our intakes, it tends to be from quite privileged schools, whether it's state or private schools. So while we don't want to sort of put off anyone from applying, what we do want to do is encourage more people, young people particularly, from more disadvantaged sort of backgrounds to come to Exeter and to give it a try. It's just something that we've been thinking about a long time. If you look at our admissions, they're very skewed towards a particular demographic. And, you know, as a university, we want to educate and help young people from all backgrounds. So we have some quite ambitious targets over the next 5 years, 10 years as part of the university strategy. And that is really just trying to enrol more state school students and more students from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds. We're also, by the way, looking at mature students as well. There's been a real drop in mature students across the sector. And one of the things that we're thinking about is, how do you help young people when they get to university as well? So it's not just about, you know, attracting them to the university. It's what pastoral support they might get offered when they're actually in Exeter. Exeter's an amazing place. And, you know, it's in, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of the world, the Southwest. But I think some students, particularly those that come from cities and other environments, can feel a bit isolated. So this is a real sort of holistic strategy, we would call it. So trying to just flag up the university as somewhere that many people should come to, you know, if it's the sort of place they want to, and then giving them support once they're in Exeter. So that's part of a very exciting plan over the next 10 years.
And you've just been mentioning to me before we started the interview about your Good Parent Educator book. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so I'm really excited by this book because it's the first book I've done which is dedicated to parents. So I've done lots of books for school leaders, lots of sort of books that summarize the field of social mobility. You know, what do we know about social mobility across the world? But what's been interesting to me is that a lot of parents feel increasing pressure in terms of helping their children in education, but they got very little advice on how to do that. And we also know from the research that parents have a huge impact in shaping young people's outcomes. So what I decided to do was to review all the research out there. And I've looked at thousands of studies. It's taken a long time, this book. And I've come up with practical tips for parents, particularly those that are sort of busy, and I'm hoping this will be read by parents from all backgrounds. And I give them a number of very, I hope, good, useful tips. So for example, when they're very young, when they're toddlers, it's good. I know it sounds obvious, but often parents don't do this. You should spend about 20 minutes a day sharing a book with them, just listening to them or reading to them. And the evidence shows that just doing 20 minutes a day can have a huge impact. So when they do start school, they're not behind others, because what we know is that if they're behind at age 5, they then stay behind it often, right up until the age of 16 or 18. So there's that. But then I've got tips on what parents should do in terms of questioning schools when they're looking at different schools, what questions to ask those teachers, all the way to what are the things where you can help your children in terms of revision tips. So one thing I talk about is really the best revision technique is testing, is asking questions, maybe doing it with sort of flashcards or doing actual proper tests, and getting your sons and daughters to actually do that rather than doing the sort of highlighting or the rereading that often children do, is a much more effective technique. I talk about homework, I talk about applying to university, and even in the early job career era, how you can help your children when they come back from university, which often happens these days, in terms of developing sort of skills of how to shine at that interview. So it's really sort of early years all the way up to looking for a job. And yeah, it's out now. It's in all good online bookstores.
It sounds fantastic and very similar to what we're doing through the magazine. A lot of your research explores the current systems in place to encourage social mobility within the school system. What do you think are some of the biggest flaws with the current system, and how do you feel these could be solved?
It's a great question. So I speak in many different countries on this now. I was in Norway a few weeks ago talking to school leaders, and I think for me there's sort of 3 things that I now sort of big messages for school leaders in terms of how they improve outcomes for all children. And I call this sort of inclusive teaching and learning for all. I think the number one thing is engage with your parents. Actually, it relates to the book. How do schools ensure that they're engaging with all their parents and that the parents are helping their children? If you can get that right as a school, I tell you, you can really improve outcomes. And often I find that with schools, parents are almost like they're worried about them more than engaging with them. So one thing is about developing what I call a parent engagement plan. And that's really understanding your local community in much more depth, thinking about how you utilize those parent-teacher meetings, how you communicate with parents properly. So one is parent engagement. The second thing we know is that teaching quality varies hugely within each school. So in every school in the world, there is amazing teaching going on, but schools I have found aren't very good at learning from that excellent teaching that's going on within that school. So another challenge, I think, for teachers, and it's something that I think all parents should ask schools, is how are you learning from the best teaching going on in your school and bringing up the level of teaching elsewhere in the school? So that's a second thing. The third thing I talk about with teachers, we get into the bit of nitty gritty of what makes good classroom teaching. And I've become a bit obsessed with this thing called effective feedback in the classroom. That's really how the teacher engages with every pupil in the classroom, finds out where they are in their learning, and gives them specific feedback to move them on. It sounds very simple, but often it's not done very well. So I do a lot of sessions with teachers on, do you know your children in the classroom and do you know where they are? And again, I think for parents, it's a really good thing to know, to ask your son or daughter, what feedback did you get today from your teachers? And if there's no feedback being given, then that's an issue. You should follow that up. So those are the main things I talk to school leaders about. Saying that, the caveat to all this is that schools can only do so much. And all the studies I've been involved with suggest that you have to address the things outside schools as much as inside schools. So whether it's early years gaps before school start, or is it helping young people in the workplace, you have to do those things as well as schools. I worry a little bit that teachers are burdened with trying to solve all of society's ills when the researchers suggest that they can only do so much. So I do work a lot with schools to improve what they do, but I also say to teachers, please don't worry too much. You're not responsible for everything. But it's very exciting because I speak to school leaders across the world, and you find that these issues are quite universal. And actually, the UK, I think, has some really amazing teachers. I think we do ourselves down a little bit. And I think there's some excellent practice in our country.
Thank you. From your TED Talk in 2019, you described an escalating arms race of education in which the poorest children are increasingly ill-equipped to fight. This is something that we're very keen to try to be a part of helping. And could you expand on this for us and how you've attempted in the work you do to solve the disparity?
So the Great Education Arms Race is something I've written a lot about. And it really is. And by the way, I'm one of these people. I'm a middle-class parent as well now, remember. So I'm doing...
You weren't historically, though.
I wasn't historically. I'm the first in my family to go into higher education. I lived on my own at 15. A lot of my friends now are amazed at what I'm doing, because of my background and where I came from. But it's a classic story of now that I've got kids, I'm doing all the things that I didn't get given. And I probably overcompensate, to be honest with you. But I've turned from a working class lad into a middle class parent, no doubt about it. And I don't think you should criticize parents for doing the best for their children. That's something you're never going to... I don't think you should stop that. But the problem is if you don't have parents supporting you, you fall further behind. And the thing that we've observed most in this is private tutoring outside school. So if you look at levels of private tutoring, so this is paying private tutors to do more lessons outside of school, that has boomed in the last 20 years in the UK and indeed in most other countries in the world. And that's fine. But if you don't have the money, if you're from a family that doesn't have those resources, then you're not going to keep up with all those kids that do have that. So I've been involved in lots of lobbying, I guess, government to improve provision of tutoring for poorer children. And that crystallized in a thing called the National Tutoring Programme in England, which was launched by the government as the pandemic happened. It's a long story, this, because it hasn't been implemented that well, but the idea was a good one. And what I'm doing at the moment at the University of Exeter is piloting a new programme, which was always meant to be part of this national tutoring efforts, which is undergraduates volunteering to do tutoring with local pupils. And I'm very excited by this. And we're going to pilot something at Exeter in the next year. And that's going to be develop a model that all universities will be able to use. And undergraduates will get an academic credit. They'll do a module. So they'll be credited for doing this. We'll have some training with local schools. And they will get to help young pupils in the region in terms of basic literacy and numeracy. So that is another way, I hope, that we can sort of level up this playing field. There's a lot of talk at the moment in the UK about leveling up. And in many ways, that's kind of what my business is about. It's about looking to what we do as middle classes to help our children and then trying to replicate that for children from poorer backgrounds, and you hope that means that young people from all backgrounds get the chance. What you want is a fair chance, right? And at the moment, sadly, I think we live in a society where if you do come from a poor background, you're really up against it, I think, even if you have all the talent in the world. And that, I think, is a tragedy. My hope is that a little bit of my work will help a few children to fulfill their potential. That's what it's all about.
You are a trustee of the Terry Ragg Trust. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that foundation?
So that's the Ted Ragg Trust.
Sorry, I've said it wrong.
So Ted Ragg was a very famous education professor actually at Exeter, and the local trust, it's basically representing the local schools in the Exeter region, but also Plymouth now as well. So it's extending. So it's a group of schools. And so I sit on the board of the Ted Ragg Trust. So that's really me being involved with schools in a direct way, I suppose, as a trustee. I'm also on various other boards, a thing called the Exeter Place Board, which is trying to regenerate Exeter over the next 20 years. And I'm on all sorts of national things as well, but I won't bore you with all that. But yeah, it's great to be involved with schools directly. I do lots of talks though. I mean, I probably do 2 talks a week. That might be a public talk to A-level students. It might be a bunch of school leaders. It might be at a different university. I try and be as public facing as I possibly can be with my work.
You've warned of a clash of classes as students compete for elite university places. Could you expand a little bit on this idea for us?
So that was something I wrote about when there were suggestions that the number of university places would be fixed. Okay, so we've had over recent years an expansion of degree places. And the reason I wrote about that sort of clash of the classes is that what we know from the evidence is if you limit the number of university places, then if you've got efforts to try and get poorer children into university, that will then displace those from more middle class backgrounds that are trying to get into those same university places. So my hope would be that we can still expand university places for all. That's what you really want. Now, there are all sorts of challenges to that. The government pays for these student loans, which students pay back eventually, but there's only so much money to go around. So I believe that we shouldn't limit places, but at the same time, I do worry about the lack of advice and guidance. And again, this is something I talk about in the Good Parent Educator book, is that often I think young people rush into university without really doing their homework on what course they might do. 1 in 3 students regret the degree course they go on to when they're at university. And I think that's because they rush into those decisions. And when you're paying a lot of money for fees, I think it's one of the biggest investment decisions you'll make in your life. So in the book, I talk a lot about really do your homework. I know it sounds obvious, but a number of times I see 18-year-olds that are just doing the same thing that all their friends are doing, a lot of peer pressure. By the way, the Southwest has a particular issue, has some of the lowest higher education participation rates in the country. So there's a particular issue, I think, in the Southwest. But generally, I think you need to do your homework when you're looking at into university courses.
I think the other thing is that there's so much choice, and often they're under so much pressure with their A-levels and getting their exams. They don't have a lot of time, or don't feel necessarily they've got the time to do all the research that they need to do into what they can possibly go on to do or where they can go on to do it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the system, you've applied to your university before you've even finished your A-levels, right?
Yeah.
You're doing it quite early on.
Personal statements, if you're considering Oxbridge, are done in September.
Yeah. In September. It's very early on. I mean, I've been campaigning about personal statements, and you'll see the minister mention me. The university's minister mentioned me last week in one of her speeches. And basically there, I'm just trying to make those personal statements fairer for all pupils. Because what happens is, again, if you've got supportive parents, they will help with those personal statements, or the tutors will help. And increasingly we found that it's not really a reflection of that young person's ideas or strengths. It's more about who they've got around them to support them doing that statement. It's become a bit of a sort of game. So we're trying to reform those personal statements to try and equal that playing field. But there is an issue, I think, in people rushing into these decisions. In many countries, you will have a year out. You'll have another year before you go to university. And I often worry that a lot of our young children, I still call them children even when they're 18, are a bit immature, actually. Maybe they need that university experience to mature. I don't know. But I think some of the choices are regretted later on in life.
Yeah. And then I'm sure you're aware of Mr. Tom Lawson from Eastbourne College, and I think it was in association with Exeter, it could have been yourself. But there is a feeling that since the pandemic, that possibly the personal statements per se have become slightly outdated. They're very restrictive. They're very difficult to do in 4,000 characters or 47 lines, and perhaps leaning more towards an interview entrance going forwards. I don't know if you've got any views on that.
I wrote an opinion piece in the Times, which was basically calling for a reform to personal statements.
It could have been a response to that.
I think it sounds like it response because it created a big response, and I was on BBC on it. And so, no, absolutely. So I'm now working with UCAS, the admission service, and the government to try and help reform those personal statements, which is a great thing for me. As we said at the beginning of this, my hope is to affect change. And so when you get these wins, if you like, it's very exciting. So that's something I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, it's something we're very interested in as well. Thank you so much for your time. I know you've got a busy schedule, so I won't keep you any longer, but I hope that we'll be able to speak again about more issues. And we're very much looking forward to reading your book, The Good Parent Educator. Definitely sounds like one to get.
The reviews have been very positive so far, which is good.
Yeah, no, it sounds fantastic. Thank you so much.